The analogy I often use with my clients is, when you've been through a trauma, it's like you have a smoke detector that just is going off constantly. And we really have to retrain that smoke detector to go, okay, like, is there actually a fire? Like, what is actually dangerous here? When do we need to sound the alarm, and when can we be thoughtful and cautious and aware? But when is it okay to, challenge ourselves a little bit here? Yeah.
Welcome to the Relationship Psychologist podcast.
Tune in every Thursday to learn with us as we interview experts.
And laugh with us as we banter about friendship.
And take action by implementing the tools and advice we provide to you each week to level up your personal relationships.
I'm Dana Mullen.
And I'm Alicia Hinger.
We are soul sisters, besties, and psychologists on a mission to change the culture of relationships.
Your journey to becoming more supported and connected starts
right now.
No.
Welcome to another episode of the Relationship Psychologist podcast. Today, hello. We're also, Jen's, if you don't know, we're recording and we're also on YouTube. So people see us.
Yes.
So a little bit of both. Today we have Jenn Corbiell here, and I'm going to read your little intro here, Jenn. Jenn is a registered clinical social worker working both in private practice and for Alberta Health Services as a clinical consultant. You have extensive training and experience in treating complex and developmental trauma, dissociative disorders, and addictions. Outside of her clinical practice, Jenn has developed brief training modules on trauma-informed practice and acts as a faculty member for Process Oriented Somatic Therapy, which is also called natural processing trainings. She provides clinical supervision to master's and PhD level clinicians and is a guest lecturer both nationally and internationally. Jenn is passionate about enhancing therapist competencies in the treatment of trauma and supporting her clients in leading increasingly meaningful lives. Welcome, Jenn.
Thanks, Jenn. Expert Jenn.
I don't know if I often put myself in that role, but thanks for having me.
Oh, you're the resident expert on trauma now.
Yes.
You have been, Jenn, you've definitely been in Alicia's ear for years, because anytime we're talking about trauma, I'm like, well, I just refer people to Jenn. I'm like, if there's anything that is like trauma outside of just, I would say like little T, like not huge, massive trauma, I'm always referring people to you. So you have been my, go-to person. And I'm so excited to be able to interview you today so people can hear more about all of the type of trainings that you can offer people and explain.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I appreciate your support, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome.
Even the client view, the clients that are people that are listening that have trauma or partners with trauma, I think they'll be really grateful to hear your perspectives too on all the different ways and different types of trauma that you treat and how trauma manifests in the body and all the things we'll get into today. So I'm excited.
Wonderful. That's exciting.
Yeah, Jenn, I know from chatting with you, you're trained in a lot of evidence-based trauma therapies. And I have a list of them, but I want you to be able to, if you can, just kind of talk a little bit about each one that you're trained in, and maybe a bit about kind of which type of client you would work with those, but just so the audience has an idea of the different types of therapies.
Yeah, good question. So I'm trained in quite a variety of modalities, and the intervention we use would really be based on the client and their needs. My primary training would be EMDR based. So EMDR currently is one of the two kind of Health Canada approved interventions for the treatment of PTSD specifically. So it's EMDR and prolonged exposure. I am trained in both. I don't do much prolonged exposure these days. And that's just a personal preference in terms of I prefer kind of bottom up, kind of body focused approaches as opposed to cognitive process. Because I think the body focused approaches tend to have kind of a longer lasting effect in terms of addressing the entire system and not just our cognition. And I think when we're only working from a cognitive place, we tend to miss a lot in terms of people's process. So a lot of my work is EMDR based. And since I've done my initial EMDR training, I've also trained in something called quite extensively in something called natural processing. So Natural processing takes traditional EMDR as well as some of the work and influence of Peter Levine from somatic experiencing, some of the work in terms of David Schnarch and kind of the crucible effect in terms of holding the heat, and some of the work of Kathy Kane and some work from Hakomi. And it sort of puts the so really what we're doing with natural processing is we are processing from a very process-oriented, somatically oriented place. So similar to EMDR in that we are using kind of tapping or eye movement and kind of looking at kind of the roots of trauma and where they're coming from, but really also at the same time, teaching people how to track and work with their nervous system more effectively, which is really ultimately what we need to do in processing trauma. So that's my primary modality. I do have training in sensory motor psychotherapy. I do have training in seeking safety, and kind of a variety of different approaches, some ego state work, but really kind of natural processing and EMDR would be my core modality. Yeah.
Can you expand just a little more on how natural processing expands the EMDR? Like it's EMDR plus somatic, right? There's some integrations in there. Can you just, and for the audience that doesn't know what EMDR is, I'm sure most people do, but let's just say that they don't. Can you explain what EMDR is as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so it was originally developed by Francine Shapiro in the 1980s. And really originally for the treatment specifically of PTSD. But now what we found is that EMDR and kind of the approach of using kind of both sensation, emotion, and cognition is really helpful for a variety of things. So not just trauma, but depression, anxiety. If people have kind of long-standing beliefs about themselves that they just know aren't true, but struggle to let go of. So things like I'm not good enough, or, I'm unlovable, I don't matter, these sorts of things that often show up in our relationships, right? We do find that EMDR can be really beneficial for that. And so when I trained in EMDR originally, what I really, it is an exposure-based therapy. So what we do is we choose a target, and a target can really be anything. It can be like a specific memory of a distressing event. It can be a thought pattern, kind of as we've just talked about, or even like a physical sensation. I get in, I have to give a public speech, and all of a sudden I have this knot in my stomach and I blank and I can't cope, right? So we can use it for all of these kinds of things. And so traditionally, EMDR has us focus on that kind of, we develop an image of this distressing event or situation, or focus on the sensation. And then we identify the associated thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations, and we use that to process on really kind of a nervous system level. And the goal of EMDR is not to make people forget things, because, well, I wish we could do that sometimes, but we can't. Not a magician. But the goal is to make these memories less distressing, less activating, and to help people feel like they're more resilient and just better able to manage kind of stressors as they come up in their life. So natural processing kind of takes that process. And really what we're doing with NP, and one of the key differences is we're paying very close attention to people's nervous system and their window of tolerance at the same time. So people are learning how to track themselves and their sensations. I'm also tracking them as a therapist and kind of noticing what I observe. And we're noticing kind of any kind of disconnect or way that people move away from situations that make them uncomfortable, and really helping them stay present. Because if we can't stay present, we can't process anything effectively. So it really, for me, has filled in some of the gaps of EMDR, specifically because I do so much work with complex and developmental trauma. Having that somatic piece, and it makes the treatment a bit more tolerable for people often, and they often develop their own kind of feelings of resiliency and capability in the process.
I love that. They're aware of their own body sensations in real time, and you're helping them track it and pay attention gently. And then I'm guessing helping them regulate when you see the dysregulation start to show up, to pause and create a sensation of regulation or safety.
Yeah, to a degree, really helping people more so though, other than just creating safety, but really helping people learn that they actually can stay with things that previously they thought were too uncomfortable or too intolerable to manage. So it's really about, we talk about this idea in trauma therapy of holding the heat, right? Oftentimes when we feel things that are really uncomfortable or really scary, we do everything possible to get away from them, which of course helps us feel better in the moment. But in terms of processing trauma, when we do that, we actually can't effectively work anything through. So we're really helping people learn in a very paced, very structured, very systematic way how they can sit with things even just for a moment longer and start to kind of develop their capability of holding space for those things and then eventually working them through.
Love that. I work with horses, like I do equine therapy, and it sounds
Yeah.
so similar, like when someone's with a horse and they're doing something scary, whether it be, a match or something, a noisemaker or whatever, a flag. And the client that's not used to horses is, I can see in their body and I can see that, the horse is a bit nervous, but once they overcome that, I'm like, just stay with it, create safety for the horse. And they're regulating themselves while they're regulating the horse, of course, it's all mirrored, right? And when the click happens, when the horse actually connects and does a thing, and you can just see them go, oh, I did that, even though I was uncomfortable, especially with the kid, they're anxious and they're nervous. And then it happens, they're like, wow, like it creates this whole sensation in the body of I was scared and stood my ground and did anyways. And now this relationship of I trust myself, I trust the horse. Like, yeah, what you're saying sounds so familiar.
Totally. Because when we just keep hitting people with skills to be safe, to be safe, to be safe, what we're perpetually teaching them is they're not safe, they're not safe, they're not safe. Right. And we have to learn that things that are uncomfortable might feel unsafe, and we can still develop ways of coping and managing those things.
Love it.
Oh, yeah. That's so neat, Jen. I love how you just said that, holding the heat. I swear I'm going to hold on to that term, holding the heat. Just, I feel like we can use that even in our sessions, Alicia, where you get those moments with couples or with individuals where we are kind of that safe base, right? And as therapists, to be able to help people in the room hold that heat so they can feel that safety of like, it's okay. You're allowed to feel this. You're allowed to stay with this. Typically you want to run from it, or you want to dissociate, or you want to, try and numb it or drink or do something.
Absolutely. Like I think, when I think about what you're doing in a PACT session and creating a container, that container is a way of holding the heat, right? We're putting people in a situation that increases their arousal, and that can be scary and that uncomfortable, but they are actually learning how to manage differently. And then, as you've experienced in your sessions, I'm sure, and as I experienced, then people can go in the world and do that on their own. Right.
Yeah. Embodied experience. That's so profound. Have that embodied experience of, oh, I know what that feels like in a body, to hold the heat, stay present, do the work, and not die. I didn't light on fire.
Yep. Yeah. I thought that anxiety was going to kill me, and it didn't. Yeah. And okay, I have a different perception of my ability there. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. Jen, how long typically is treatment, would you say, when you're doing trauma work with clients?
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, this is a question I get asked all the time by new clients, and it's such a difficult question for me to answer. And, I think what I was saying to you, Dana, in one of our previous conversations, is what I often tell people is we're going to go as fast as we can and as slow as we need to. I get that it's uncomfortable. I get that people want to get through things. I get that they want to feel better. And that's important to my clients, and that's important to me as well. But we really have to work in a way that fits with people's nervous system, so that they don't feel like they're overwhelmed and like they're being re-traumatized and like they can't manage what's happening in therapy. So sometimes if people have, not a lot of history with trauma. So as an example, I have some clients who come in who've been in a car accident, who are struggling to drive. Like sometimes otherwise life has been pretty normal. Sometimes we can do that in like 5 to 10 sessions. People feel pretty good. Whereas, my clients with complex trauma, and specifically those with dissociative disorders, these would be people who often, because of their history, I'm seeing for quite a long period of time. So it's really very individually based. It's based on what are people's goals, what is a successful outcome for them. And sometimes what we'll do is sometimes I'll work with people for a period of time and they'll get in a good place and they'll be like, you know what, I want to go live life for a while and try some things out. And then as things come up, I might see them again for periods of time. But the initial period of treatment is often fairly intensive. And then as people start to do better, we space things out. And yeah, it really varies. Yeah.
Are there any populations, Jen, that treatment is counterproductive or counterintuitive, like any certain disorders you don't work with trauma, or active addictions maybe, or?
Right. So it's really, again, kind of case by case. One of the things I do pay attention to, and one of the things we are often advised to monitor specifically for EMDR, is pregnancy. And so and again, it's really individually based. So what they often recommend is that we don't do EMDR during the first trimester of pregnancy. For me, it's more of a judgment call though, because if somebody is so distressed that it's going to be harmful to their baby and their pregnancy, I probably actually would do some treatment sooner than later to help settle their system. But if people are able to kind of manage and cope effectively, we may, if they're pregnant, wait till they get through the first trimester. I also don't work with people who are in active episodes of psychosis, obviously, because they need some stabilization before they're able to process and integrate the work effectively. And then with addiction, there's so many different schools of thought out there on when is the most appropriate time to treat somebody who has an addictions trauma. For me, I kind of look at the bigger picture in terms of some of my clients who want to get sober would never get sober if we didn't treat their trauma, right? Whereas some people are able to get sober and then kind of focus on that work later. So it is often something that we would do later in addictions treatment when people have some foundational skills for maintaining some periods of abstinence and that sort of thing. But I do have clients, as an example, that I will just do some contracting with them around. So it's like, if you can't stop drinking because you're so triggered, what I try to do with people is we work towards like, can you stay sober for ideally like 12 hours before and 12 hours after? Can we contract around that? So we can do some processing, but there's still an opportunity after the session for that work to integrate. So really kind of case by case, ideally later in the process, but sometimes people just need to start doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah. What about personality disorders? Any personality disorders that are counterproductive to trauma work? Or maybe this what you do with them, I suppose, is another way to ask that question.
Yeah, I think any, similar, to what we talk about in terms of work with PACT, like I think people are capable of having secure functioning relationships. People are capable of doing trauma work, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that personality disorder specifically would rule people out. And quite frankly, a lot of people with personality disorders have personality disorders because of histories with trauma, right? So what I do find is, depending on the personality disorder. So for example, if I'm working with somebody like with borderline personality disorder, we might spend a lot more time up front building kind of those foundational kind of distress tolerance, kind of emotional regulation skills before we get into processing. But I do think if people are motivated, if they're ready to do the work, if they have good resources, to support them as they're doing the work, because it does get challenging and difficult. There's not many people that I certainly wouldn't see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
That's good. Yeah.
I have questions about couples too. Like, so when you see a partner in your office, or one part of a partnership in your office with the trauma, how can we support, or how do you support the other partner that's on the other side? So let's say it's a first responder, and that's their partner has trauma because of first response, with their job. And so you're working with them to process the trauma stuff. How can the partner, first of all, understand maybe what that looks like in the nervous system and in the brain? And because I get a lot of people saying like, I want them to go back to the way it was. Can we go back to the way it was? And I'm like, this brain nervous system is now changed because of this complex event, or events often that happens. So what's your advice for the partners to support, and how can even we as therapists help support those partners through the process?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really helpful for partners to have psychoeducation on trauma and the impact of trauma on development in the nervous system. If I'm seeing somebody individually and they are in a relationship, I will often bring the partner in, not to do couples therapy. Obviously, you're either the couples therapist or the individual therapist, so I wouldn't do both. But it is helpful to have the partner in. One from the perspective of providing information, but also, we don't have a good ability to see our own blind spots, right? So while I trust my clients and what they're coming to me with and with what they're disclosing their experiences, it's also helpful for me to get an outside perspective in terms of how they're interacting with the world and how that plays out in their relationships and influences the people around them. So I do think it's useful, when there's trauma, honestly, for both partners to have an individual therapist, even if the partner is not individually impacted, but they are in a way, right? They're in a relationship, they're co-regulating with each other. If somebody's struggling more with regulation, kind of learning how to work together collaboratively and supportively is really beneficial and can play such a huge role in terms of moving trauma treatment along, but also keeping the relationship intact, because these sorts of situations and events are so taxing to our relationships.
Would you say the same for then the kids involved, like having some kind of psychoeducation at the developmental level of the child of what's happening to their parent and their parent's nervous system?
Absolutely. Yeah. And even, simple things like as you do with PACT and as I do kind of individually, and when I see couples, teaching them how to track each other, kind of how to pay attention to those signs that, our nervous systems are going offline, that we're not in our window of tolerance anymore. And so what strategies can we use kind of collectively and collaboratively to help the system settle?
Right. And I think maybe for the kids to know that, it's the parents' now new default mode to flip their lid a little bit or whatever. So how can we as a system not take responsibility for that or not ownership of that? Because you're a kid and your mom or your dad, that's the first responders, having some stuff. And again, I think, yeah, it's such a complex, like it's such a, right, we refer the individual to you and then we're seeing the couples in our office and I'm hearing about the kids, I'm hearing about the partners, and I'm hearing about, how can we support each other? And it's such a complex, and like you said, it affects the whole system.
Yeah. Yeah.
The family. Yeah. The whole system.
Yeah, it feels like though just having those open conversations and some psychoeducation around what's happened and what does this look like now, I think open conversations and support is it's huge in a family, just so then obviously the identified person with the trauma also feels more supported when everybody knows, okay, this is now my default, like this is kind of where I'm at and I'm trying to work through to get to another side and some more settling in their system, but to have that support around them would just be massive.
Yeah. And even to your point, Alicia, like I also think about, what trauma defenses and coping mechanisms do we develop that are helpful for us, but are also problematic for the system, right? Like I think about, some of my clients who, when they get really anxious, they want to make sure their kids are safe constantly. And so they don't allow them to take risks or, to play on the playground and do things. The analogy I often use with my clients is, when you've been through a trauma, it's like you have a smoke detector that just is going off constantly. And we really have to retrain that smoke detector to go, okay, like, is there actually a fire? Like, what is actually dangerous here? When do we need to sound the alarm, and when can we be thoughtful and cautious and aware? But when is it okay to, challenge ourselves a little bit here? Yeah.
That's massive. That's massive.
I love that analogy. And I know, Jen, when you and I were kind of chatting, we were talking a little bit about the different types of treatment that you do, but also the work of trauma. Can you speak to a bit of that like a lot of people when they think EMDR, they're like, okay, I'm going to sit there and we're definitely going to be doing these specific kind of techniques, but there's a lot more in the work of trauma than just that one particular technique.
Right. So, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I think this is a really common misconception of trauma treatment and what it looks like. So, I tend to use the model that's, out there in the literature of like trauma treatment tends to involve 3 phases. So the first phase would really be about safety building and stabilization, right? So how do we start to regulate the nervous system so that we can do effective processing? How do we kind of minimize risks, get people in safe situations, kind of set them up with resources so that they're actually able to start doing some effective trauma work? Then we move into kind of reprocessing and mourning, which is where things like EMDR would fall. So the reprocessing and mourning is really working on the specific trauma memories or triggers, and grieving the impacts that that trauma has had in our life, which is a very important part of the process. And then we move into reintegration, which is now that I've worked through things, and as Alicia was saying, like now that my life has changed and I can't go back exactly to the way that I was, how do I move forward now that this is unfortunately a part of the package, right? And I think when people come in for treatment, they often think, well, if I'm not doing EMDR, we're not doing trauma treatment, right? And trauma treatment is about learning to regulate our emotions. It's about learning to communicate in a different way. It's about learning to set boundaries. It's, learning how to develop healthy relationships again. Like it's so multifaceted. So the actual processing and the working on the triggering event is a part of it. But there's many, many pieces that go into kind of recovery from trauma and a traumatic event.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great breakdown of having the 3 phases that you can kind of conceptually, work your way through and understand, oh, I'm in the last phase. And maybe that last phase actually might take longer than the other 2 phases, I'm thinking. Right? Because that's
sometimes the first phase takes a really, really long time, right? Like if I'm working with somebody who has a dissociative disorder, as an example, we may spend a very long time doing kind of safety building stabilization, because if my body is a threatening and dangerous place to be, it's really going to, I'm going to have a very hard time being present and mindful enough to actually start working on things, right? So that phase can take a long time. Yeah, the reintegration. So there's no kind of guideline in terms of this takes a couple of months and this takes, right? Like it's very individually based and based on our history, right? And I think also when the trauma occurs, right? If we have early developmental trauma, a lot of our resources get expended doing kind of that emotional regulation, kind of safety stabilization work. And so a lot of the work is going to be there, right? People who don't have early developmental trauma, they feel safe, they feel connected, they feel secure pretty quickly. And so their resources really go into relational development and cognitive process and kind of more abstract ways of thinking. So depending on when it occurs, our process can really look very different.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I hear the impatience in my office of someone that's done their work, or they think they've done their work, and they come in and they're like, especially if it's relational trauma, there's an affair, a breach of the relationship. And they're like, well, we've done this stuff now, so why am I not over it? Like you said, well, it's bringing this new, it's part of the package, like you said. Now there's this new package deal that's changed. And so how do we bring the new package and the new vision and the new concept of our bubble, whatever, using the PACT language, how do we integrate that into this relationship now? It's there. You can't unknow what you now know.
Yeah. And I see this so often in my work with addictions, right? When people have been struggling with addictions for a long time, they're used to things happening quickly. They get a quick fix, they feel better quickly, right? And sometimes that gets transmitted onto the partner where it's like, well, I've made these changes. Like, why are you still bothered by this? Right. So it's like everybody has their own time and their own healing process. And just because I often say, specifically to couples, like it's taken us a long time to get here. So let's be reasonable in terms of what it's going to take to get out. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I think there's a significant change in the brain. Like I'm thinking of, people that have had a, complex trauma history, I should say complex, and they're now done their work, and then to go back, quote unquote, back to the same job or back to whatever their vision of back to looks like. Because the brain changes, the nervous system changes, and even the work they've done to overcome that and to be more expansive, to go back to that idea of that same job. Like, how do you integrate back into workplace, relationship? How do you help them conceptualize that maybe there isn't a back and we do it differently?
one of the things that we often talk about as part of treatment, because people, I get this idea, like, I want to go back before, right? And that's often because, there's an innocence there, there's a freedom there, there's kind of a place where the system was relaxed and less activated. So I think what I often encourage people to think about is, let's think about what was useful about before and how we might bring some of those elements into the now, right? But the other thing I often think about with clients, and without kind of blaming, because most people's trauma, like, it's not their fault, but also the system we had before struggled and also got us in a place where we struggled to manage and to heal and to work with what was going on. So we also want to help work through some of those pieces so that, we can manage effectively in the future. Right. So I think there's a way, but to your point, Alicia, a lot of my clients do, as they're going through a trauma healing process, experience pretty significant life changes. And some of my clients will go, I actually never really liked that job, and so we might actually have to think about doing something totally different. Like, now that I have different coping skills, I recognize that job worked for me because it was really structured and I felt really competent, and I felt really capable, and it worked for me. And now that I look at it, I'm like, I don't even actually like what I did there, but it just helped contain me in a way, right? So some of my clients really honestly will change jobs, their relationships might change. This can be part of the process, not always. And when we're not changing those things, the conversation is more one of, okay, how do we go back and manage this now? Because it is kind of associated with a difficult and stressful time in your life. So are there different skills or kind of strategies we might put in place so that this environment feels more workable for you as we move forward?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that's what I see a lot too, is people that don't want to, because they've had such massive changes, and then not even the associated stress of that job. Like you said, they're like, I was doing that job when I didn't know some stuff, and now that I know some stuff and I've evolved as a human being and I see the world way different, not necessarily negative, like I've done the work to be more expansive, I can't be. And the pressure, I don't know if you get this, but the pressure I get, the pushes from the insurance companies to get them back, return to work days, return to work. And I'm like, they are not going back to that job probably ever. Like, but the pressure of like, I don't know about you, I get these letters that I'm not even doing them anymore, but letters that say, please, you have 10 sessions or 12 sessions to do CBT and prolonged exposure. And at first of all, I'm like, I don't do either for trauma.
Right.
New research says those don't work long-term. I don't know, that's my bias. And then I get them back to work. I'm like, wow, that's a great system.
I totally agree. And like you, I don't do a ton of like high pressure insurance work for that reason, because my goal is not to force somebody back to work. My goal is to get somebody to a place of functionality. And sometimes work is a really important part of that process, and sometimes it's not, right? Because there's very few people I see for trauma that could do that in 10 sessions, right? Like, that's just really, we're setting people up, right? And, I feel for clients in those situations, because inevitably they end up feeling like a big giant failure because my insurance company is telling me this is how long it should take. And I'm not feeling better and I'm not ready. And I always, when I get those referrals, I like to just have a really explicit conversation with the client about like, this is my job and this is what I think can happen. And this is what you need to be prepared for, because 10 sessions, probably not going to get you back to work from a trauma.
Yeah. And may never want to go back to that job again. Yeah.
Right. And especially if they're off because of some trauma related to the workplace, we might be looking at something drastically different for them. Yeah.
I think just permission to say that, people just to hear what you just said, permission to be like, it's okay, that's where your trauma existed. And if you want to, if it's part of your journey to grow and expand elsewhere, that's really okay. The relief in there for people. Even you say to me, my person's like, okay, thanks, Jen. That feels really, really, really good.
And I think even as therapists, like one of the things I always like to remind people that I supervise is just reminding yourself of like, what is my job, right? Because when we end up in these situations, they create these impossible binds where it's like you feel the pressure and you feel the intensity, and it's like, but what is my job here? You know, my
Yeah.
job is not to be an employment facilitator.
No, and it's interesting, Jenna, as you're saying this, that insurance companies are looking at how many sessions until you can get these people back. And yet, if this was a physical health issue, if this was cancer, and it was like, okay, so, well, we don't know. I mean, for some people, it's 3 to 6 months. For some people, it's 6 to 12. I mean, and an insurance company isn't going to nail down that the same way and say, well, you need to tell your oncologist that you're only covered for 3 to 6 months of chemo. But yet
Right.
for mental health, very different. This should be very structured and very quick.
Nor does an insurance company say to an oncologist, here are the treatments you must use.
You.
Right? Which is what
No.
they do to therapists on a regular basis, right? Like, this is what we've heard is quick and efficient. So this is what we'd like you to apply. And it's like, well, I have to make the decision that's in the best interest of the client that I'm working with.
Yes.
And yeah, and you have to align with it as a therapist too, right? I mean, we get trained sometimes in several modalities, but we find the ones that align with us as well. We can't do work on somebody or with somebody that we don't align with. I mean, I think at the beginning, young therapists early on, we learn a model and we kind of do that model. Alicia and I definitely did CBT when we came out. That was it. I wanted to do. Yeah, I wanted to do emotion stuff. I really liked Virginia Satir, but it was frowned upon back then. It was like, well, you should just do the cognitive stuff. But we find what aligns with us as well. And so we are doing what we would want done for ourselves as well, what we stand for. We have our own integrity.
Yeah. And I have had, as part of my training, as I'm sure you have as well, I've had EMDR done on me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't prescribe things that I wouldn't do myself. And I think that's such a good point, right? Like, I remember when I first started doing EMDR, it was very controversial in the beginning because we had a hard time explaining why the eye movement did what it did. I mean, now there's pretty clear research and, use of functional MRI and that sort of thing to demonstrate the efficacy of it. But when it first came out, I remember writing proposals, having to explain why this radical thing that I was doing would be beneficial. So, yeah.
Evolve through our modalities.
Yeah, Jenn, you've spoken a few times, just for our audience, you've spoken of a few different kind of diagnoses of dissociative disorders, complex PTSD, and just regular, I guess, PTSD. Can you explain a little bit for our audience of what the difference is?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think about the best way to explain this to the audience. So PTSD is often a diagnosis. Now, let me be really clear here. I don't love the DSM definition of PTSD. I actually frown upon it in a pretty significant way, because a lot of the people that I end up seeing in my practice for trauma treatment would never meet criteria for PTSD as defined in the DSM, right? This doesn't mean that they don't benefit immensely from having trauma treatment. And especially when we have early developmental trauma, like, our brains don't often, especially if we're small children, our brains don't encode things in detailed memories, right? People will come in and they'll describe a felt sense. They'll come in and they'll describe I just know that something feels wrong, right? That their ability to integrate a full memory early in life is very limited. And so that's one of the reasons why our definition of PTSD is problematic, right? Because they want a specific event, has to be kind of life-threatening, or has to be directly witnessed. And we know now that there's so many things that contribute to trauma that can still create kind of that same experience. So often, though, individuals with PTSD, they'll have nightmares. They will have avoidance of situations or events that remind them of trauma. They can have intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. And when we get to the dissociative end of the spectrum, often what happens is people will have periods of amnesia. So they'll forget important events beyond the scope of normal forgetfulness, right? They'll lose gaps of time, larger periods of time. So we'll hear people say things like, I don't remember anything from my childhood, like anything 13 years and earlier, I have no memory of that, right? And sometimes people's brains will function in such a way that we compartmentalize that traumatic experience. So historically, people may be familiar with what was called multiple personality disorder. We don't use that term anymore because people who have dissociative disorders don't have multiple personalities. What they have is a compartmentalization of trauma material, and certain parts of our system hold parts of that trauma story. So based on which part is activated, we may present differently, our vocabulary might be differently, and sometimes the communication between our parts isn't very smooth, right? So we all have parts of self, right? Every single person, but in a brain that hasn't experienced a lot of trauma, our parts work together effectively, right? I don't have to tell my responsible part to go to work, right? I don't have to tell my child part of self to go have fun and enjoy life. This just naturally happens in my system. But when somebody has PTSD and particularly complex trauma and dissociative disorder, those parts don't work together as effectively anymore. So our work is really about bringing the system back together in a way that's collaborative and helpful for the larger system and a person's overall functioning. So,
could you speak a little bit to that? I think for our audience, they love the parts talks. We've done a few of those talks on our podcast already, but just about how the traumatized parts or trauma, maybe there's more than one, you know, the parts that hold the somatic memories or the body stuff, how you, when you say to make space to process and integrate it into the larger system, just can you give us a little taste of what that would look like for someone that's listening that maybe is nervous about that or interested in that?
Yeah, so sometimes, it can be as simple as doing some visualization work and imagining talking to our younger part of self and giving that part of self what that part needs. When working with a dissociative disorder, though, it can include things like, if somebody feels like they're 5 years old all of a sudden, right? And doesn't realize how much time has passed. Some of the work might be around teaching developmentally appropriate skills to that part of self so that that part of self feels soothed and settled and then can work together. And it might also include using other parts of the system, my more adult part of self, to kind of work together with that part to help kind of manage and soothe the system as well. So
is the goal to integrate those younger parts to the whole?
Yeah. And integration, particularly when we're working with dissociative disorders, is a bit of a dirty word. People with dissociative disorders don't often love the word integration because it feels like we're making parts go away, right? And so really what we want to do is get parts to work together in a way that's effective. And sometimes this may mean that, as the trauma gets processed, parts are settled, they're not so active. And so it feels like they're going away. Have they gone away? Well, not necessarily. They may just have a less important role in the system. Yeah.
Or a new role, like you said, like that's their new play role.
Exactly. A role that works together more collaboratively, right? Because even, I know, Dana, we talked about you've done some work with IFS, right? Even that protective part of self, the protective part of self can sometimes be problematic in our system because it evokes fear. It stops us from taking risks. It stops us from doing things. And so often it's not about getting rid of that part because it has an essential role, but it's about how do we use that part in a more helpful way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that keeps an eye on things as we kind of figure out how to work through some of these complex emotions, right?
Yeah. And just even being like more mindful of these different parts and acknowledging them and building some relationship with them.
Yeah, exactly.
What about, I know that we hear people a lot talk about big T trauma and little T trauma. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jenn?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an important conversation to have, right? Because I have so many clients who will come in and say, well, I haven't had trauma, right? um, so a big T, and so big T and little T trauma is just a really helpful way of conceptualizing that. So big T traumas are things that we naturally think about when we think about something as traumatic, a car accident, an assault, our house burns down, things that everybody looks at and they're like, woo, yeah, that's traumatic, right? Little T traumas are things that in and of themselves may not appear to be traumatic, but when we put a bunch of them together, they really do have the same cumulative effect on our system. So this can be the breakup of a relationship. This can be the loss of a job. This can be like instances where we don't feel seen or where we start to feel neglected, right? All of these things can be, changing to our nervous system and change our behavior. So important to kind of look at both, right? And I think one of the things that often happens in the trauma world, which we talked a little bit about, is this idea that, we all have a way of making sense of things that make them feel a bit more tolerable, right? So we often do this when talking about trauma, when we say things like, well, it wasn't that bad, or like, I only got hit one time, or like these kinds of things, right? It's our way of trying to make something that feels too distressing or too unmanageable feel a bit more manageable. And it's still a trauma and it still has an impact, right?
How important is that, Jen? How important is that to your work? Like that's my story. Like I know, EMDR was super valuable for me in my trauma work. It was amazing. But that was one of the things I kept saying was like, yeah, but mine wasn't that bad. Like and I still to this day have a part of me that will minimize it. Like right now in real time, I have a part that's just like, wasn't that bad. So how important is that in your work to, or what's your process with clients like me, for example, that come in and be like, well, compared to so-and-so or compared to my clients, it's nothing.
Well, I think, I often start where the client is at, right? Because that defense is in place for a reason, right? And I think naturally when a situation is out of our control, we look for things to be in control of. And one of the ways we often do that is we take responsibility for things that aren't our responsibility. Gives us something to work on, right? So it's like people who say, well, I shouldn't have been out that night when that happened to me. Like that's, it's kind of my fault, right? Often as we work through things and people get more discernment, the responsibility goes back into the most appropriate place, right? But the other thing I often find helpful for people is a bit of psychoeducation around when it comes to trauma. It's not so much about what actually happens and more to do with our experience of it. So for somebody, being in a car accident is just as bad as, getting broken up with by somebody, right? So I don't tend to kind of rate this is worse than this. That said, the literature would say that the more personal and bodily intrusive a trauma is, so if we know the person and if it impacts our body or our safety directly, the more likely it is to produce PTSD related symptoms. So that's definitely something we want to pay attention to, but a trauma is a trauma. And if it's important to somebody, then it's going to be important to me to work on. Yeah.
Interesting.
Like that was a great explanation, Jen. Really great. Is there anything that you advise people, maybe who've been in trauma treatment before or who are recognizing through even just listening, oh, maybe I have some trauma, anything like books, resources, like in terms of that, but also maybe some take-home things that you like tell your clients to do that just helps them learn how to regulate themselves a little bit more and take care of themselves when they kind of get triggered?
Yeah. So, I mean, I am very somatically oriented, right? So a book that a lot of my clients often relate to and find really helpful is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, right? Because it gives a language and a way of relating. I can't tell you how often clients will come in and we'll talk about kind of common signs and symptoms of trauma. And the first thing they say is, oh, so I'm not crazy. This actually happens to other people. Right? Like we have this assumption that there's something wrong with me or only I experience things in this way. So it is really helpful if people can get some education and learn some things about the common signs and symptoms. Get some support if you can, right? Especially if things have been kind of lingering for a long time, right? People often judge themselves or feel like there's something wrong with me because I can't get over this or I haven't worked it through. And the way I kind of explain that to people is, our nervous system is always working towards a process of completion. So if it's coming up and coming up and coming up, it's because there's something there that's not complete. And we can't always complete that on our own because we all have ways of disconnecting. Every single one of us is going to do things to move away from things that make us uncomfortable because in the short term, it's easier. Right. So starting to just kind of notice what happens for people, kind of notice kind of what some of their challenges are, talking to friends and support people kind of can take the power and the heat out of some of these kind of worries. Yeah. And there is treatment out there. Yeah.
And I think I love that, the process of completion, that you're going to keep going through the process until it's completed for as long as that might take, and maybe having just the grace, the compassion for yourself and for your partner or your friend or whoever's going through it, that there's not a fixed date or process schedule. It's a process of completion in everybody's system. And everyone's system is, like you said, your parts, some people's emotional parts are, in the way of completion, or their intellectual parts are in the way of completion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we can learn just to be aware of our body and learn some kind of, especially initially, learn some kind of grounding skills and get the support of our family in doing that, that can be really beneficial as well.
Do you have any favorite grounding skills that you can teach our audience quick?
I do actually. So this is a skill that I often use with some of my clients who have dissociative disorders, because when we have somebody who struggles with dissociation, we have to train them to pay attention before we can train them to be mindful, right? Mindfulness and dissociation are actually rival brain activities. And so it's hard to train people to be present in their body. So one of the things that people can often do to have a really brief experience of just kind of settling down is to use their procerus muscle. So at the tip of your nose where it meets your forehead, there's that little indent there. And just starting to apply a little bit of pressure there. And you'll just notice often your breath might just go down just a little bit. Your body might relax a little bit. So we'll often get people just to do this for 15 to 20 seconds, just to have a really brief experience of settling. This is a point actually that gives us access to our medial prefrontal cortex. So it's useful when doing mindfulness skills, even when I have people practice mindfulness in my office, to have them try to visualize things from the front of their brain and specifically from this place. Yeah.
We did a Hakomi training, Dana and I, years ago. And one of the things they had us do was we were doing partnership, and they said, put your hands in a place where you feel calm, or where it helps you feel calm. And I was like right here. Like, I was like, so the girl I was working, I was like, put your hand on my forehead. And that was like my place to feel, I had no idea. That's interesting.
People naturally do this. Like when we think about, playing with babies and stuff, we always like rub their little heads and, and there's a lot of high frequency pressure points kind of around your eyes and your cheeks and down into your jaw. So even kind of backwards threes across the face can be really soothing for people as well. So sometimes, I'll have my clients do this themselves. And sometimes, especially if we're working on relational connection and safety, if they're comfortable, sometimes I will do this on their face as well. Yeah.
That's lovely. Oh, that's so great, Jenn. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to kind of leave our audience with? Anything else that maybe we didn't chat about that you feel like is important to say?
Yeah. Good question.
Take this massive topic of trauma and
I know, and boil it down into a sentence. Hey,
even the boxes, like I don't like the boxes of like big T, small. Like I love that you just were like, trauma is trauma. So whether you think it's big T or small T or complex or specific or whatever, trauma is trauma. And then boil us down to.
Yeah, what I would say to people is, it takes a lot of courage to kind of ask for help and to take steps and to put yourself out there. But I like to remind people that it's treatable, right? Trauma is a very treatable mental health condition. Sometimes it takes a lot of work. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort, But one of the exciting parts about my job is I get to see people get well and kind of really move forward and feel a lot better about themselves and their lives. So I appreciate sometimes the fear and the caution when people think about getting help, or when they think about putting themselves out there and, people are going to hear things about me and that's embarrassing, or like it's shameful. And there is support, and we can work through these things and experience life in a different way.
And there are people like you who are trained and who are passionate and who are caring and know what they're doing. And so when you're searching for, in your, wherever you are listening to this, look for, like what Jenn said, look for the things like the natural processing, the EMDR. Of course, my bias is don't look for prolonged exposure, look for the
I think that's a really difficult, not so pleasant treatment. And
it's
not my
recommended lots. Just unfortunately it does, and people just don't know. So yeah, people do their homework and maybe ask questions. Like, what are some common questions that maybe you think people should ask when they're phoning a trauma specialist for their own work? Or what are some good questions someone might be able to want to ask their therapist?
Great question. I would ask people about their training. A good trauma training on average takes at least 5 to 10 days, right? For a basic level, right? So if people have done like a 1 or 2 day workshop, they're not certified in what they're doing, right? So I would ask for that. I would ask a little bit about their experience with trauma, their general approach. I often encourage, I do this with my clients, but I offer like a free 30-minute consultation so people can phone and have a conversation and just see how we feel in terms of our connection. Don't be afraid to go and see a couple of people and see like who feels like a fit, because ultimately your relationship is going to play such a key role in terms of your ability to trust and do work with that person. So it really does have to feel like they align, right? Yeah.
I love that. Empower the clients listening, people listening, to do like Evita said, ask the questions, and then don't be afraid to be like, not gonna hurt our feelings. We want you to have a good experience. So find someone, like you said, that aligns, personality and language, and
absolutely. I'd rather people say you're not for me than to come and feel like they're struggling through and not getting what they need.
Yeah. I love that, what you just said too, Jenn. I know Alicia and I feel the same way. Like, interview different, whether it's a trauma therapist or a couple therapist, whoever it is, interview them and make sure that you align and make sure that they do have training and experience. I like to tell my couples sometimes, or clients that I talk to, when you're going out for a meal and you really want like really good Italian, you're not going to go to Moxie's. You're going to go to a really good Italian restaurant. So find somebody who specializes in what you're looking for. Not, at the beginning, lots of therapists are generalists, and that's okay if you're coming in with, maybe some lower symptoms and I need some coaching and I need some guidance. But, complex PTSD is something that you really need to find somebody who's multi-trained, like yourself.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll need to find.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenn. We'll leave in the show notes, there'll be links to your website as well, if anybody wants to book in to see you. And we have loved having you.
You have Instagram and Facebook and all the things. Do you have
I just have my website right now. Yeah. I'm not all over the social. Yeah.
Well done.
Maybe at some point. I'll keep you posted.
Hey, website. It'll be linked for sure. And are you taking new clients, or can you offer referrals, people that or?
I am taking new clients. I do have a bit of a wait list right now, but I also have a network of highly experienced, very skilled people that I trust very much if people need to be seen quickly and I need to refer them to someone else. Yeah.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So wise in what you do, and appreciate the things you said. And I'm sure people listening are going to, greatly appreciate the little gold nuggets you left for them, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenn.
To see both of you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We're really glad you're here with us on this journey.
The best way to support this podcast is to subscribe and give it a 5-star review.
See you next time.
This has been a Bread Dog Studios production.